Okay, the theme is refuge. And I thought it was such a good one that I mentioned it to Helen Bernard, who's the College of Humanities Director of External Affairs. I informed her of the rich traditions of refuge associated with Buddhism, not imagining that it would fall upon me to speak about it. But here I am. So, refuge is at once a very personal commitment in Buddhism. Actually, this should be moving, yeah. So, refuge is at once a very personal commitment in Buddhism, and at the same time, a very public demonstration of that commitment. When one seeks refuge in Buddhism, this has traditionally been associated with a sometimes very public rite of passage, and this may be fraught with social tensions. For example, in my study, I often run in traditional China a Chinese eldest son who is otherwise obligated to his Confucian duties to family to produce a male offspring, Confucian patriarchy to take care of his elder parents. He decides he wants to become a celibate Buddhist monk, and of course that doesn't square very well with mom and dad, because it's not going to continue the family legacy and so forth. So there's these kinds of complications when someone in a culture like this wants to dedicate themselves to Buddhist teaching. But the Buddhist world is diverse, and the same son who's doing this in Southeast Asia, in a East Asian Buddhist country, may be looked upon by his parents. This is a great offering that brings merits which are incalculable. And so the parents look upon this as a mark of status for them in society that they're able to offer their son in this kind of way. The point is that there are different Buddhist traditions, and these traditions may have different reactions to an ostensibly similar act, taking refuge. And this is interpreted according to prevailing socio and political conditions. And even within a single tradition, the circumstances of history may change how the notion is conceived and applied. A few years ago, I had occasion to visit Southeast Asia, and I went to Laos, one of the places I went to. It's a very wonderful place to visit. And observing there, it's got a historical association, long historical association with Buddhism, and Buddhism is undergoing great revival there. And I noticed that there are the number of young monks at the monastery. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. But then when I questioned about it, I realized that most of them enter at the age of primary school, and they leave when they graduate from high school. Why do they do that? They go to the monastery because it's the place where they can get an education. The monastery provides an education. Most of them don't see it as an ultimate career path, but they see it as a means to get an education, and then they can go out and into society. Now, in Southeast Asian countries, they don't mind this. They feel like, they've had informative educational years. They've had basically the bulk of young men in society undergoing this kind of Buddhist training. They're going to carry this legacy with them, regardless of what career they choose throughout their life. So it's a kind of a nod to the foundations, the Buddhist foundations of Lao society. Now, across the border in Thailand is a country which is relatively more developed, has developed educational institutions, compulsory education, largely subsidized by the state, has universities not unlike our own. And in this case, the requirement to fulfill your Buddhist duty is carried out somewhat differently, that young men in Thai society feel a lot of pressure, maybe obligation, wouldn't be too strong a word, to actually spend a summer as a Buddhist monk. So in this case, I call it, it's kind of like the summer camp model. But it's still important, in Thai society. If you want to be an upstanding member of society, you need to do this. If not, you will be looked down upon. And I can't remember how many monasteries I went to in Thailand, and there's a picture of the portrait of a king as a young man, I used to call it, because it would be I was going to say the current king, but he passed away as of today, I think, or yesterday. The king, I think 88 years old. He's been ill for a long time. But the main thing is that he provides the model, that he went off and did this, and he's in his monastic robe with his shaved head. And so this is kind of the model for all young men in society in order to do that. And again, it exhibits that the role of the foundation plays, that taking refuge in this kind of context, in the Thai context, again, very similar traditions of Buddhism, but in the Thai context, it's carried out in one way. In the Lao context, it's kind of actually a more traditional, still retains a more traditional approach in which it serves this function and this educational model. Okay, so that's my prelude. And in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try and cover the notion of refuge in both Buddhist and general religious contexts, give us some kind of idea to talk about it in this way, and the basic model of Buddhist refuge introduced in early texts and teachings, and then some idea, as I've just done, of the social repercussions of implementing the idea of refuge. If time allows, I'd like to talk about it as in an application in the Chinese and East Asian context, but we'll see how time goes. Okay, there's the clock there. I should keep my eye on that. And then finally, with some concluding comments on how to understand Buddhist refuge as escape from the world and escape to the world, how it operates in both of those kinds of ways. To begin, however, I'd like to have a look at the notion of Buddhism itself. Okay, so the map here, first of all, the thing to notice is the extent of Buddhism, historically in its various iterations. And I'm not going to go through all of them here, but Buddhism has truly been a pan-Asian religion, and this is why the study of Buddhism has been so intricately tied to the study of so many Asian languages and cultures, because it has touched virtually every culture at some point. Last spring, we had a guest speaker, Emeritus Professor Louis Lancaster from the University of California, Berkeley. And he showed a slide like this, and I'm going to repeat a comment that he made. He said, if you could draw a circle around this whole region that Buddhists has influenced, that's half of the world's population is in that circle. So I think that underscores the importance that Buddhism has had. Now, Buddhism isn't prevalent in all of those places currently today, but Buddhism has had a strong impact throughout all of these regions, and is still practiced in many of the regions today. So, while the modern idiom of the study of religion neatly codifies Buddhism as a quote-unquote world religion, with a presumptive universal set of doctrines and practices that can be taught in a neat package in world religions type courses, the reality is one that we might want to look at as overlapping Buddhist sensibilities. One way of mapping these sensibilities is according to region. There's the Southeast Asian region, the Tibet and Himalayan region, and the East Asian region. Even within these, we are fraught with sub-regional diversities, driven by linguistic, social, and political divisions. No wonder the study of Buddhism is so hard. I keep consoling myself. A Buddhist scripture or practice that becomes central in one region may be virtually unknown or unnoticed or unremarkable in other regions. This prompted, again, I'm referring to Louis Lancaster when his talk was about the the study of Buddhism, and one of his remarks stuck with me. He said, "We are nowhere near the end, nor are we any longer at the beginning, but we are at the end of the beginning of the study of Buddhism." And I thought that sums it up very well. The study of Buddhism is going on for, over 100 years or so. And we have made some progress, but we've got an awful long way to go. Okay, so next. Oh, the topic is refuge. So in Buddhism, they have this thing called the three refuges, and it's deceptively simple. That if you want to dedicate yourself to Buddhism, you say you give voice to the three jewels or the triple gem. I take refuge in the Buddha. Of course, the Buddha is the one alleged to have had the experience of enlightenment, delivered the teachings. The Dharma or Dhamma, there's the teachings that are attributed to him, and the Sangha. And probably many of you in the room are familiar perhaps with Buddha and Dharma, those terms, but Sangha may be one that's a little bit less familiar. And Sangha is the community that continues the legacy of Buddhism throughout its complex of institutional structures and practices. Okay, so while the Buddha and the Dharma is what we're ostensibly attracted to, because the Buddha is this great person who had this wonderful experience, and this teaching is the Dharma, I think it's the Sangha that we should be paying attention to. We should focus on. The Buddha and the Dharma often operate kind of out there as universal conceptions of the ultimate Buddhist model, the Buddha, his doctrines, and the Dharma. And this resonates very well with the world religions model, which likes to kind of pair. We've got Jesus in the Gospels, Muhammad in the Quran, and we've got the Buddha and the Dharma, right? So there's a kind of simplicity to the structure that is appealing, but it's really the Sangha where so to speak, the rubber hits the road. This is where the presence and influence of Buddhism in any society has been actualized as a real living force, where Buddhist teachings and ideals are applied to real world circumstances. So it's always the Sangha. I mean, we have the legacy of the Buddha and his teachings, but it's the Sangha who applies them, builds the institutions, has to work out the kind of the political and social intricacies of actually operating in a society. And there's where we get the texture and the differences that take place among Buddhist communities. Okay, so Buddhism is not unusual in offering refuge. All religions attempt to do so. And a common, if basic, model employed in the study of religion is one that I put up here, is profane and sacred. And the role religion plays in transitioning between the two, transforming our profane, imperfect, quote unquote, normal human experience into a basis for ultimate meaning and value, and ultimately a perfected state. So this is the model, that and sort of used by historians of religion to look at this. And what becomes important then is the path of transformation, because again, we set up the dichotomy between the profane and the sacred, but the question is, how do you get from the one to the other? I mean, what's the plan? So crucial to this transformation is the institutional network of beliefs, practices, and so on that a religion provides. In this sense, the temple, the church, the mosque, etc., provide what I call the workshops for this transformation. Inside these walls of these institutions, one enters a symbolic world that invites us to a realm of a glimpse of the perfection that's possible through artistic representations, ritual practices, and ceremonies, articulated spiritual guidance and teachings. This training ground is essential to our transformation and any hope that we may have of ultimate perfection. So, turning back to Buddhism, in Buddhist terms, the two worlds, the profane and sacred, that we are caught between are samsara and nirvana. Samsara represents, I recognize many faces here, so you'll bear with me as I go through some of these basic information, but I think perhaps many people are not even familiar with kind of really basic Buddhist concepts. But samsara represents this repeating cycle of birth, life, and death, this kind of wheel of rebirth, reincarnation. And it's driven by one's actions and consequences, one's karma, through the past, present, and future. So in Buddhist terms, we are stuck on this cycle and interminably stuck, and we have been for a long time. But this world that we experience now in this current form is one of but incalculable number of worlds that we have experienced and will continue to experience. Nirvana represents or release liberation from samsara and the debilitating effects of karma from this constituted existence. And in the Buddhist quest, the question is, how is this path of transformation possible? Okay, so that's the question, because this is how how we seek the refuge. Now, in terms of models, there are two prevalent models, two basic models in the Buddhist worlds. One is the Theravada Shravaka model, which is tied explicitly to early Buddhism and continues to be prevalent in South and Southeast Asia. The model is the Arhat, who is the disciple of the historical Buddha, who claims to have attained the same insight and enlightenment as the historical Buddha did. The Mahayana model is tied, I think I can say, implicitly to early Buddhism, but represents kind of a later reform movement within Buddhism, in some ways a real revolution. And it's prevalent in North and East Asia, and its model is the Bodhisattva, the being bound toward enlightenment, the path toward cosmic Buddhahood. Now, in a decision that was not an easy one, I decided to focus for our purposes only on the Arhat model because of lack of time. But I thought it behooved me to at least mention the existence of both of the models, because depending on which part of the Buddhist world you go into, you'll see mention of prominent mention of one, if not both of these models, but one will be the one that is largely followed. So, if we look at the Arhat path, and again, I'm sorry, but I spent a long time trying to understand Buddhist texts. People who have never looked at them before tend to not like them very much because they're hard to understand. But I like them because I think they kind of get at the essential message in its as close to the original form as we can get. So I'm going to make reference here to the Shamanaphala Sutta, which is one of the alleged early dialogues of the Buddha, when he talks about the fruits of the life of a shamana, or the fruits of a contemplative life. And it gives a comprehensive portrait of the Buddhist path of training. Maybe a little bit of background. A shamana won't be familiar to most of you. This was part of a movement in ancient India, which produced people like the Buddha, people who were dissatisfied with the typical explanations of, let's say, conventional religion, for lack of a better word, and sought off to kind of seek new paths. We might call them spiritual seekers. And so the fruits of the life of the shamana is a dialogue in which the Buddha sets out what he thinks are the advantages of this life. Now, it's kind of interesting because the person that the Buddha dialogues with is this king at the time, Ajatashattu. And this king, when we are introduced to him in the Buddha Sutra, he's kind of sitting around one evening, and it's kind of like there's no TV, there's no there's no no kind of entertainment. So what does he do? He um, he says, well, maybe there's a religious teacher in the area that we can invite in, or that we can actually not invite in, but go and visit, and we can dialogue with. And so he talks to his courtiers and says, well, who do we have? And so they go through the courtiers mention a number of names. It's kind of there are a number of fairly famous or prominent teachers at that time, and it's a kind of list of the usual suspects that he goes through. But eventually they get to Shakyamuni, who is actually on summer retreat with his disciples not too far away. And so the king says, okay, let's go see him. Um, so the king goes to visit him rather than, and this is very symbolically, it's very important because it represents a kind of a status thing that's going on, that the king goes and prostrates himself to the Buddha, right, and symbolically exhibits the fact that spiritual power, the spiritual insight, has superiority over temporal power. So when the king gets there, he talks about the king. It's very interesting because the king's sentiments are very practical, as you might imagine. So what he wants to know is, why should I let anybody in my kingdom become one of you guys, a shaman, or one of these? What benefit is there to it? So a little bit echoes the questions that we have today about well, what good is that degree for? Right? So it's a little bit along those lines. So the king comes and he goes to the Buddha and says, well, what? Why would anybody do that? What's the benefit? I want some practical benefits. So the first thing he starts, and kind of goes through ascending order, but he says, the first thing is the respect that is accorded to one for spiritual pursuits, as exhibited very much by the king himself, coming, prostrating himself to the Buddha, that it shows the kind of respect that people have in society. And so the king says, yes, indeed, that's a good point. What else? And then the Buddha says, well, you have this freedom from household concerns, right? So this is one of the attractive qualities. You don't have to worry about your laundry and making money and all those kinds of things. You're kind of freed from that. And the king says, yeah, okay, go on. And then he talks about practicing the path of virtue, and he talks about how virtuous his disciples are in their practice. They practice celibacy, abandoning false speech, abusive speech and idle chatter, abstaining from harming anything living, abstaining from overeating, abstaining from frivolous activities, and so on. The frivolous activities, it's whenever I read these, I think, time and place decides what frivolous activities are, oftentimes, because, and of course, I think we can see some of them, but dancing, singing, instrumental music, watching shows, wearing garlands, using perfumes or scents, um, sitting on high seats or in luxurious beds, um, um, accepting gold and money, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, the point is that they give a fairly long and elaborate list of what that means in this context. But eventually, it moves up into higher pursuits, like developing mindfulness and alertness. And it talks about how no matter how you carry yourself, what you do, whatever kind of activities, you become mindful and alert. It talks about being content with the bare necessities. You live a very simple life. And then it talks about abandoning the hindrances, covetousness, ill will, sloth and drowsiness, restlessness and anxiety, and uncertainty, eventually leading to a state of joy and happiness. But we're not done that. Then we're getting into the kind of more elevated parts of the Buddhist path, which involve uh, meditation and advanced states of meditation. And this is not the time, and I'm not the person to try and talk about in detail about those states. But um, I invite, if you're interested, I invite you to go and look because it is extremely uh, meticulous in terms of that. The main thing is that uh, through these states, one is moving to a state of without sensual pleasures and removing discursive reflection, and eventually elation and joy. That in the end, you have a complete state of mindful equanimity. And why do you have that? It's because that's the state in which you can have access to um, insight and wisdom into the nature of reality. Okay? Now, in terms of this particular text, it talks about that in terms of, well, what we would call supernatural powers, being able to see all your previous lives, being able to see all the previous lives of everybody else. So it's a really kind of, it seems rather fantastical to us. But I think the main point is that we have, it gives you, again, to follow the Buddhist teaching, gives you insight into the nature of the Buddhist path and the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, again, um, um, one could spend a long time, talking about these things, but for our purposes, let's just run through them very quickly. But the idea is that life is suffering, and what this isn't meant to be a negative condemnation like it might seem to be, but it's the truth that all things are impermanent, or that all things that come into being pass out of being, and that's an inescapable fact of existence. So that also applies to our kind of our own lives, and that's so no matter how much joy we experience, ultimately we're going to suffer because of the fact that we're constituted beings. It goes on in its analysis to say that suffering has a cause. It arises out of craving. So this is what the craving is, the kind of the fuel that creates karma, which puts us on this cycle of birth and death, which the Buddhists call samsara. But the third truth is it says that even though that's the state that we are in, it can be eliminated if you eliminate craving. So in other words, if you take away the fuel that is stoking the fire, eventually the fire will burn out. I mean, this is a kind of a rough and crude analogy, but it kind of gives you the idea. And it also talks about the path that you can tread in order to do that, the Eightfold Path to Nirvana. So the Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right sustained effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. I like to think of it in terms of the three components that it is addressing, and the development of wisdom or insight cultivation, development of moral cultivation, and the development of mental cultivation. And these are, in a sense, the three pillars of the Buddhist path. I'm going to, in the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead here. A lot of people like to think about, to try and get us back into the institutional framework. A lot of people in the modern world, but not just the modern world, like to talk about this tension between spirituality and religion. Whereas, spirituality represents this inner search for enlightenment, this individual awakening, which is unique and tends to be more about the individual than the group, and about an inner quest rather than an outward performance, whereas religion is associated with the organized systems of belief that they tend to involve group activities, rituals, and rules, and they follow the established teachings of others codified into institutional forms. So through this tension, I think if we look at it in terms of Buddhism, we start to ask the question about the reality of refuge. You know, and one way of asking the question is kind of a who moves ahead and who stays behind. Now, in a sense, the question that I'm asking and the way that I'm asking it is a bit unfair because I'm presuming kind of a modern, kind of liberal perspective. And of course, Buddhism developed in cultures and societies that were not based on ideas of equality and so forth. So they tend to reflect, institutionally, they tend to reflect the values of the societies that they developed in. But I think as Buddhism moves forward into the modern world, it continues to have to address some of these concerns in ways that they haven't before. So this is one of the reasons why I bring it up here. So we have a kind of clash of values between the long-established institutional norms in various Buddhist countries and the modern liberal ideas that many modern Buddhists bring to this. So in this sense, you know, the people who are thought to be moving ahead, following the Arhat path, are the monks, okay, and the people who are kind of staying behind are the givers, okay. So we have this kind of dynamic that the people, the givers support the monastic establishment. In fact, you know, the monastic establishment really depends and thrives on people's donations. And here, what we see here is that people, even for their daily meals, monks go out, and this is true in Theravada countries. Monks go out on their daily rounds and they beg alms, and people quite willingly give support to these because why? Because they think that they believe that they're earning merit, which will help them in the path. And if you believe in reincarnation, you know that it's going to take a lot of time and you've got a long way to go. So a little bit of progress here is probably all that is really needed. It's interesting if you go to sometimes in Laos, if you go to stay in the hotel, you can even they even encourage you. They got little packages to buy that you can go out on the street in the morning and give to the monks as they're coming by, to kind of perpetuate this ritual. But the reality of refuge then creates an elite world of monks. It's a institution of tiered practitioners, privileging monks. Nuns in some traditions are not even allowed, but where they are, they typically occupy a secondary of still highly respected status. You know, if you look at, for example, we can look at it. You know, there's definitely a gender aspect of this, that the monks, of course, are all men, and even, you know, even they can be very young, but they have a status higher than everybody else, all lay people who are not monks. So I'm going to skip, I see the time, and I'm not going to do the East Asian excursion, unfortunately, but I'm just going to skip to my conclusions if I can. And you get a quick view of what you missed. Okay, anyway, so finally, in conclusion, I'd like to suggest some ways of understanding Buddhist refuge in terms of both escaping from the world and escaping in the world. In terms of escaping from the world, we normally think of Buddhism as a spiritual refuge, a place of escape from the world of suffering and samsara. Ultimately, as we have seen, this is the ideal the Buddha represents and his teaching, the Dharma, intends to propel us towards. But the reality of the refuge that the monastery offers may be much different, and it may be the temporal refuge as a safe haven that attracts most of its adherents. For example, um, in some countries, I'm not talking about the contemporary situation necessarily, but historically, that the government would require labor of its citizens. But of course, if you went to the monastery, you were exempted from this kind of labor tax. Military conscription was another one, that if you could avoid military conscription by becoming a monk. Um, you could perhaps try to avoid legal prosecution on the grounds that monks had a kind of immunity from legal prosecution. You could escape from difficult marriages. In fact, historically, some temples became very famous as places where women could go for safe haven from a difficult marriage. You could escape from familial obligations. As I said, maybe the best example, and I don't want to make the connection too direct, but currently in Taiwan, Buddhism is very prosperous and thriving, and it's mostly built around the nuns who have turned to Buddhism in great numbers. And although it may not be spoken directly, at least to me, it seems like to me that a lot of them are looking for an alternate to the family obligations that they would normally be subject to, and that Buddhism offers them a path to education, career, etc., that would otherwise not be available to them. And also there's the idea of escape from economic taxation, that in many instances the Buddhist monastery is a tax-free establishment. So it encourages certain kinds of relationships in which people can use that as a way to avoid certain kind of taxation policies. Okay, so what about escaping in the world? So in some grand sense, I think we need to look at it as the escape in the world, and it is in the prospect of nirvana. But usually in terms of the institutional framework, it's an idea of escaping to provide the context of nirvana, not for oneself, but for all. It's a transformation of society. And the creation of merit that one makes within the monastery can, in some sense, be transferred throughout society. The best example that I think in terms of what's going on currently in the world, and again, I go back to Taiwan, is right now we hear in Buddhism reference to humanistic Buddhism is a very common formulation for contemporary Buddhist movements. And in some sense, as a response to kind of Western liberalism, but very much maybe in keeping with traditional Buddhist ideas. That the idea is that in humanistic Buddhism, that you don't escape the world, but you transform the world. So you don't. Your idea of nirvana isn't to escape to some kind of otherworldly goal, but to transform the world into nirvana, if I can put it that way. And I think that's the motivation that really fuels much of the Buddhism in many parts of the contemporary Buddhist world. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I guess we have time for a few questions. I'd like to thank you very much.